Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm Rebecca Thoman, and this is Harlan Limpert, Wave Harlan, and we're here this morning to talk to you about expanding end-of-life options in Minnesota. I'm a physician by training. I was trained in family medicine at the University of Minnesota, and I currently work for Compassionate Choices. I manage the campaign for medical aid in dying, which we'll be talking about today, and I've worked in the public policy area for more than 2 decades. Compassionate Choices is a national nonprofit. Our mission is to improve care, expand choice, and empower people to chart their own end-of-life journey. Our vision is for a society that both affirms life, accepts the inevitability of death, and supports everyone in choosing end-of-life care that reflects their values, priorities, and beliefs.
And my name is Harlan Limpert. I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. Until my retirement 3 years ago, I was Chief Operating Officer for the Unitarian Universalist Association. I'm a volunteer for Compassionate Choices. I've been a chaplain for years, and I co-founded a group called Interfaith Clergy for End-of-Life Options. The Interfaith Clergy group is a group of clergy, just 5 of us shown here, representing 6 different Protestant denominations and Reform Judaism. Our mission is to promote understanding and acceptance of diverse spiritual beliefs so that every Minnesotan can make end-of-life choices that are consistent with his or her beliefs. Another member of the Interfaith Clergy group is Pastor Ingrid Rasmussen. Perhaps some of you know her. Ingrid is the lead pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church in South Minneapolis. All of us members of the Interfaith Clergy group come to this effort because we have all in our ministry held the hands of those in the last weeks, days, or hours of life. We know how important it is for people to have agency in their life, to have the ability to determine how and when their life ends. As we all know by now, January 19th, 2021 marked the awful reality of 400 deaths occurring in the US as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not a person in America has avoided being impacted in some way by this pandemic. Many of us, perhaps all of us, have lost friends, family members, neighbors, or coworkers to this pandemic. If there had been any hope of avoiding the topic of death arising in our consciousness, COVID-19 has erased that hope. That's one of the reasons Rebecca and I share this presentation with you, to lift up ways that each of us can take charge of our lives at the end of our lives so that we may know all the options that are available to us at the end.
The other thing that COVID-19 has done is really raised awareness about the kind of suffering and isolation that can accompany an end-of-life experience. And so it's something that we're united in wanting to avoid. We're all looking for a peaceful death, a connected death with loved ones around us. And it makes us think about what is a good death. As Atul Gawande said in his book, Being Mortal, life is a story, and in stories, endings matter. This is a great photo. What year was this, Harlan? This is sort of a picture of what we kind of imagine our end of life will be.
It's from 1900, actually.
1900. She looks pretty good, surrounded by medical care, doesn't look like she's suffering. But in fact, this is more the reality of what end of life is like today. Thanks to medical technology, most of us, probably 1 out of 2 of us, will not be able to speak for ourselves at the end of life. No longer do we die from accidents or infections. We usually are living a long time and dying slowly from chronic diseases. In fact, about less than half of us will die at home, even though the majority of Americans want to die at home. And a full 10% of us will have some sort of invasive surgery in the last month of life. So I love this cartoon. It kind of sums it up. You've got 6 months, but with aggressive treatment, we can help make that seem much longer. So I wanted to start by just reviewing the current end-of-life options that we have. Of course, and I think this is the default in medical care, to pursue all life-sustaining treatment, do everything possible. However, we can also refuse life-sustaining treatment, and we can also discontinue treatment once it has begun if we decide that the side effects are no longer worth it. We can also opt for hospice care, which is comfort care. It's after all treatment of the disease has stopped, and we're basically just providing relief from symptoms, managing discomfort, supporting the family. Sometimes patients will suffer despite best attempts of hospice, and they will be sedated. And it's generally patients who cannot speak for themselves, who appear to be suffering. Their physician and their healthcare agent together may decide we need to give more medication until the patient is often put into an unconscious state. And sometimes even the medication may suppress breathing. But that is completely legal, and it's done all the time for patients suffering at the end of life. Another option for patients who have the capacity to make the decision, they can stop eating and drinking, voluntary stopping eating and drinking, VSED. And I'm sure some of you have had experience with friends or loved ones who went through that process. At the end of life, they may decide that they don't want any more treatment. They're just done with the suffering, and they decide on their own to stop eating and drinking. It's not horrible. People can get through the hardest part of that with support from hospice. However, it can be really hard on families to watch loved ones. It generally takes about 7 to 10 days of no food and no water. And then the last option, which is what we're going to talk about today, is medical aid in dying. Medical aid in dying is a medical practice in which a terminally ill adult of sound mind can ask for and receive a prescription medication that they self-ingest for a peaceful death, if and when their suffering becomes unbearable. Many people think of the Oregon death with dignity law, which is what medical aid in dying essentially is and has been modeled after. So where is this authorized? We know now that 22% of Americans live in a jurisdiction where this is available. Oregon was the first state to authorize medical aid in dying. It's Death with Dignity Act. Back in 1997, we have more than 22 years of experience now with this law. Washington passed it 10 years later, and Montana passed it in 2009 after a court ruling. Vermont was the first state to pass it through the legislature, and then beginning in 2015, it was a rapid expansion with California, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, Maine, and New Jersey. So altogether, 22% of Americans live in a jurisdiction, and legislation has been introduced in a number of states, a couple dozen states, including Minnesota, and we'll be talking about that today. Before I go further, though, I do want to clarify what medical aid in dying is not, because some people will associate it with, for example, euthanasia or assisted suicide, and there are no death panels. So it's none of those. Euthanasia is what we do to our pets. So it would be giving an injection to put our pet to sleep at the end of life when they're suffering. That's not what this is. There are no injections involved in medical aid in dying. And it's also not suicide. When I think of the distinction, both clinically and practically, suicide is not necessarily anyone with a terminal diagnosis. It's someone who's generally mentally incapable and has maybe a psychiatric disorder. The patient wants to die because of their disease, and they often die by a violent means, maybe an impulsive act. They may be alone, and the goal is self-destruction. Contrast to that medical aid in dying, which only is for people with a terminal diagnosis and about a 6-month prognosis. They're mentally capable, so they're able to make their own healthcare decisions. Psychologically, they don't want to die, they want to live, but they are dying because of the disease. Medical aid in dying is generally planned. It takes a number of steps. Families are usually involved, and the death is peaceful by a medication, and really the goal is self-preservation. So in a lot of ways, the two are very dissimilar, and we stopped using the term suicide for a number of reasons. One is that legally, it is not legally defined as assisted suicide or mercy killing. Every statute includes this phrase to make a clear distinction, because assisted suicide is illegal in the same states where medical aid in dying has been authorized. So they're very distinct, different actions. I also wanted just to take a minute and point out that people think of death with dignity as the term that is equivalent to medical aid in dying. I think that's because the Oregon law was the first law and that was the name of it, and other laws have also used that term. We've stopped using it for a couple reasons, to generally, just in general, to talk about the practice. One is because we had some feedback that using that term sounds as if this is the only way to die with dignity. And that's not so. Everybody determines their own way to die and what dignity means to them. And so for some people, suffering is very much a part of a dignified death. Also, the term dignity seems to imply that it is the loss of functioning at the end of life that is undignified. Being unable to get up, to toilet oneself, to dress, to feed oneself. And that's really not what this is about. Because there are plenty of people who live dignified lives with physical disabilities who may not be able to do some of those activities at the end of life. And that doesn't mean that they're undignified or their life isn't valuable. So we've kind of tried to separate those two things and say, dignity really is within the individual and their determination. So the bill that has been introduced in Minnesota is called the Minnesota End of Life Option Act. It has been introduced every year since 2015, and it will be introduced again this year. The lead authors are Senator Chris Eaton, who is a nurse, and Representative Mike Freiberg, who is a public health attorney. So just to give you a little bit of the details of this legislation, who qualifies? You have to be an adult, age 18 or more. You have to have a terminal diagnosis with an approximate 6-month prognosis. And that, of course, we know that's not an exact science, but it's the same criteria used by hospice to qualify for hospice. You also have to be mentally sound, able to make your own healthcare decisions and understand the consequences of your decisions. And you have to be able to self-administer the medication, which primarily means to swallow. The process is a multi-step. You must make an oral request and submit a written request, and then the attending physician or nurse practitioner will determine your eligibility, be sure that you qualify, do some counseling that provides you with a full list of alternatives, and it give you a reference to hospice. We really like people to be enrolled in hospice because medical aid in dying shouldn't be a first option, it should be a last option. And so the physician will likely talk with you about hospice and offer a referral if that's wanted. And then refer you to a second physician or nurse practitioner who will go through that process with you again, confirm your eligibility and your prognosis. So if the consulting physician concurs, then you will go back to the first attending physician to receive the prescription. If the consulting physician or nurse does not concur, no action can go forward until there's a mental health assessment. And it's generally the mental health status where physicians might differ. The diagnosis and the prognosis are usually pretty clear. And then the determination of the mental health professional is final. So it's not like, you keep shopping until you find someone who says you're capable. Just one assessment is done, and if you do not qualify at that point, then you are not qualified. There's some other safeguards built into the law. No health professional or anyone is really required to participate. Anyone may opt out. There is liability protection for those who do participate as long as they follow the sequence and the criteria. And there is no impact. People ask this all the time. There's no impact on life insurance, again, because this is not defined as suicide. It is not suicide on the death certificate, so it is not considered suicide. So at this point, I'd like to give a little bit of information about what we know about the other states where medical aid in dying has been practiced for years. And I give more of the data from Oregon because we have the most from Oregon. It's collected, actually, they collect the data and put out an annual report every year. And then we also have some cumulative numbers for from the 22 years of practice. And so the data I'm giving you today is either from 2019 or it's cumulative, and I'll share which is. So for example, since 1997, so for 22 years, a total of just over 2,500 patients have received a prescription under the Death with Dignity law, and almost 1,700 have actually ingested the medication. So those are not huge numbers. That's fairly small numbers. About 68% of the people who request medical aid in dying are cancer patients. The next largest group have ALS or another neurodegenerative disorder, and then COPD and other diseases are at a lower incident. 90% of the patients in Oregon who request medical aid in dying are enrolled in hospice at the time of the request, and most of them die at home. So this data is important, I think, because sometimes there's concern that, well, if people can ask for medical aid in dying, they'll do that instead of going to hospice, or somehow this is competing with hospice. It's not, in fact, at all. I think of it as an option within the whole hospice array of options. But by and large, we want people to be enrolled in hospice, and those who require or who request medical aid in dying generally are. And then I add this data, which is the demographics, is that most of the users are by far white, educated, and insured. And I think it's clear that this has become a white upper middle class issue. People who feel a lot of agency in their life want control at the end of life. But I think it's also important that there was concern, 20 years ago when the legislation was first being enacted, there was concern that, oh, this would be used against people, like used against minority groups, used against the disabled. They'd be forced or encouraged or coerced to participate in this instead of being treated or given hospice care. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. The problem actually has been the lack of access to medical aid in dying by people who have lower incomes, in part because government health insurance does not cover this. And they would have to pay out of pocket for the costs of the treatment or the consulting visits and the medication, et cetera. So actually, Oregon was the first state to cover the costs of medical aid in dying in their Medicaid program, so the state portion of Medicaid will cover that. And that was in response to disparities in access. Just to give you an idea of how this works, in 2019, 112 physicians actually wrote prescriptions, close to 300 prescriptions that year. So it's not a situation where there's Dr. Death writing all these prescriptions. It's being integrated into medical care. And there's been in the 22 years, there's been absolutely no reports of abuse. There's been no physician discipline. There's been no legal action. And even the Disability Rights Oregon organization has put out a statement saying not only have they had no complaints of abuse, but they've actually had complaints that the requirement for self-ingestion is discriminatory. So a lot of the times we come at this and we have these ideas about what it's really like, and it ends up being 180 degrees in the other direction. The report also these annual reports contain more detailed information about which medications are used, the time until death. And I encourage folks to go to that website and take a look at the reports if you really want to deep dive into some of the data. Just to show you, just to touch on some of the data from the other states, in Washington, California, Colorado, and Vermont, the patterns have really held that a small number of patients are receiving prescriptions. Of that number, about 2/3 are actually ingesting the medication. And I would say there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that, these are calendar years, so people who receive prescriptions may not ingest in the same year. But we also know that in some states, there are waiting periods in which time people may die, or they receive the medication and for whatever reason, they're not able to use it. So We know about two, and they may have changed their minds. So about 2 out of 3 actually do go forward and adjust the medication. The vast majority are enrolled in hospice. Again, by and far, these are used by cancer patients or ALS patients.
And Rebecca, may I add
Yeah,
that many
please.
patients, as you well know, report that the fact that they have the medication and can take it if they choose gives them an enormous amount of comfort during their illness. As you say, they may never use it, but the fact that they have the option to use it if they want to gives them comfort. And I can imagine, personally, I can imagine that being the case.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And we've also found that in states where medical aid in dying laws passed, there's actually been sort of an increased attention to palliative care and hospice. And that has also improved in that people are more aware of it, they're talking about it. And so not only has it not detracted, it's also added in that way. So I just wanted to share with you a little bit of survey information. We've seen national surveys from, I think, as far back as 1997 that have shown about 60, anywhere between 66 and 76% of Americans support medical aid in dying. Even if we call it a physician-assisted suicide, their support is strong. We did a survey back in 2016, and I don't have the language of the survey here, but we didn't just say, hey, are you for or against medical aid in dying? We actually defined it as it's defined in the law and asked people their level of support and then broke it down by some of these categories. And we found that overall 73% of Minnesotans support this. In every political party, a majority supports. In every region, greater Minnesota and in the metro area. We also noted that even by religious groups, every religious identity group supported this as an end-of-life option. I like to point out that Catholics are especially high. There's 71% support as compared to Christian at 52%. And I think that it's interesting because the Catholic Church is often one of the strongest opponents in terms of that they really stand opposed to this. But if you actually talk to the Catholics themselves, they are actually supportive. The same year, we did a survey in the Minnesota State Fair, and this is the actual language. It said, when a mentally competent adult is dying from an incurable and irreversible medical condition that is expected to end the individual's life within 6 months, do you think the individual should be allowed to obtain from a physician a prescription for medication that may be administered to end that person's life? So that's basically what it is. Oh, I don't know why my other data didn't show up here, but 68% were in support of that. And the State Fair poll is not scientific, but it's pretty big, and lawmakers care a lot about it. And then this last survey, it was really important, and I think our Interfaith Clergy has used this a lot as they talk with congregations. So Lifeway Research is an evangelical, I think they're Nashville-based survey company that surveys for churches different issues of the time to see where parishioners and people stand. And so their question was, when a person is facing a painful terminal disease, is it morally acceptable to ask for physician's aid in taking their life? Vast majorities of people of every religious group say yes. So I think that's really food for thought too, as we speak with communities of faith like today. So I think our next slide is, because we can't be with you one-on-one, we tried to come up with some of the common questions that we get from audiences that we think you may be thinking about. And so we'll address some of those for you. The one I get often is, can I put this in my healthcare directive? Can I ask for medical aid in dying in case I get Alzheimer's disease, or if I become incapacitated? And the answer to that is no. I just want to really be clear that a healthcare directive becomes activated when you no longer can speak for yourself. Medical aid in dying is reserved only for people who can speak for themselves. So the problem with a disease like Alzheimer's is that by the time you are within 6 months of death, you've lost the capacity to speak for yourself. So that's a question we get all the time.
There's a kind of a related question, Rebecca, you may want to point to, and that is, can a person with dementia, and it's related to this, but can a person with dementia request medical aid in dying? And what would your response be to that?
Well, it depends on, if someone is dementia it's a series of symptoms. So if they have the capacity to make their own medical decisions, and if those are consistent over time, then no diagnosis excludes you specifically. It's your functionality at the time. The problem is that most of the time when people are early in dementia and do have capacity, they're not yet terminal. So realistically, it's very unlikely that someone with dementia would qualify for this. I would mention that, and this is a sort of a separate topic, is that Compassion and Choices has put together a toolkit for concerns about dementia, so that when you do your advance directive, this really enables you to walk through some of the considerations that someone facing a dementia diagnosis might want to think about. And as you experience progressing disease, what kind of treatment would you want in response to that change in your health? And you can specifically lay out what level of care you want based at various stages of a dementia diagnosis. And so we have a dementia toolkit on our website. I encourage folks to look at that if dementia is one of the issues that you're caring about and is on your mind.
And I'll tackle number 2 and 4 because they're related to one another. Who is opposed to this legislation and why? I can tell you that in the religious world, as we saw from the earlier graphs, the majority of people of faith in every religious tradition are enormously supportive of medical aid in dying. However, the leaders of these denominations tend to not be. Now, the Unitarian Universalist Association, the church community of which I'm a part, happens to be the exception. In 1998, they passed a resolution saying that they are in support of medical aid in dying. They used different language at the time, but it was without question supportive of this sort of medical procedure. But the other denominations have not yet voted to support it. The United Church of Christ has come very close, and other denominations like the Lutheran Church are evolving in this direction, arguably, but they've not passed a resolution yet in support of medical aid in dying. Similarly, the secular leaders have tended to be opposed to this. And an example would be gun control. Many people in America are more in support of gun safety legislation, but when the legislation actually gets voted upon by the legislative leaders, they tend to be opposed to it because they're concerned about the minority of people who are against it. So it's the leaders really that are holding us back.
And I would say we had a booth at the state fair that year of the survey, and by and large, even if Minnesotans that I've met, and Wisconsinites were there, who don't support this for themselves, or maybe feel like they don't know if they would do it, or even those who might be just shocked and horrified at the thought, are also willing to say, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's not right for me. There is still a small, really vocal group that says nobody should be able to do this because it's wrong. But I think most people, even if they may find it personally wrong for themselves, would not deny this option to others.
And that's basically the position of the Interfaith Clergy group. We're not promoting this or encouraging this. What we're saying is that people ought to have the right to make end-of-life decisions that are right for them based on their values, their personal values. So another question, Rebecca, is how confident are you that this legislation will become available in all 50 states in 10 years?
Not in all 50 states. I think our goal is that 50% of the American population would have access in the next 10 years. So certainly the South is going to be the last to do, but no state in the Midwest yet has authorized this. I want to see Minnesota be first. I think we could be. It's likely to expand on the West Coast and on the East Coast. That reminds me that another question that I sometimes get is about, well, why don't you just go to another state where it's authorized? If you want this and you don't have it in your state, why not just go there? And I would say a couple things about that. One is that every state has a residency requirement, so you have to be a resident of the state. So you could move there. If those of you who know the story of Brittany Menard from a few years back, she moved from California to Oregon. But that is really difficult to think about doing when you are in the last 6 months of life. A, people cannot afford that, and B, people don't want to leave their family, their loved ones, their health care, their home. And so our view is more that it shouldn't matter where you live. This shouldn't be a regional thing where if I go here I can get it. If I live here I can't. So we don't think that moving somewhere or going somewhere is a very reasonable option for people. The other question that comes up sometimes that I like to point out is that sometimes this law gets compared to what they call assisted suicide laws in other countries. So other countries, even Canada, but the Netherlands, Belgium, where they have been practicing some form of assisted suicide for many years, it's very different from the way it is practiced in the United States. One of the biggest differences is that they do not require people to be terminally ill. They do require that people have untreatable suffering, but they don't require a terminal diagnosis. They also don't require that it be taken orally. They do, in fact, give people injections. In fact, in Canada, most of the time people are being injected. They're receiving the medication intravenously. So those are some real differences. And I think that the method that we use in the United States is best suited with our culture, where it balances both people's autonomy and independence, also feeling the desire to protect people who are considered to be vulnerable. And so we've struck this balance. It was struck back when the Oregon law passed. And so it's really difficult to compare the two or to say that there's a slippery slope, we're going to become like that, because it actually, those were formed in a very different sort of culture. There was nothing where it started like our law and then changed to that. The only change to the law that has happened in Oregon in the last 20 years is that they changed the law. They have a waiting period there of 15 days from the first to the second request, and they basically gave doctors the ability to waive the waiting period for people who are particularly ill and may not live 15 days. So that's really the only change that we've seen.
I realize, Rebecca, I jumped us over the middle question, which is, what is the status of this legislation in Minnesota? Would you address that, please?
Sure. So the law was first introduced in Minnesota in 2015. There were a series of information sessions around the state. It got a hearing in the Senate in 2016, informational hearing. Then for 2 years, after the 2016 election, for 2 years, it really didn't go anywhere. We had the bill out there and we were trying to educate on it, but there was no willingness to move it. After the last election, then the House became more willing to take up the talk, and we did have an informational session on this in the fall of 2019, which was during the interim. And it was a very successful hearing. So we've not had the bill actually been able to be heard in a committee and passed from a committee yet. And that is our goal coming up. Any bill has to go through a number of committees in both the House and Senate. There's some willingness to look at it in the House. It's really tough. Everything is really tough now because so much is focused on dealing with the coronavirus. We have a budget coming up. There's redistricting. There's racial unrest. There's so many problems but we always are dealing with a lot of problems. So I think our goal is to educate lawmakers. We'd like everybody who supports this to talk to their lawmaker about why it's important for them, and continue to move this forward in whatever committees are willing to take it up and talk about it. So we're hopeful that we'll get a hearing this year.
Great. And if people want more information, can you share our email addresses?
Thank you. Yes, so I put the Compassion and Choices website, and that's the Minnesota page. If you leave off Minnesota, you'd go to the general page where if you're interested in learning about dementia, just type dementia into the search and it'll take you to our dementia tools. We also have a Facebook page for if any of you are Facebookers. And you can feel free to reach out to either Harlan or myself at at our email address. If you have any questions, you want to know what more you can do, you just have, you'd like to talk, feel free to reach out to us. Anything you want to say here, Harlan?
No parting words other than thank you for paying attention to learning about this important topic. And I hope you'll share the information and your thoughts with others in your community. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thanks.